Hey everyone, we're back with another edition of Bad News, one of our favorite editions because it's a Friday edition. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
All right, Ben, we have some great topics today because it's been, of course, a great week for the media. They just can't quit themselves. They love it so much. We're going to start off by talking about the coverage of President Biden's speech last night, which could only be described, I think, as slobbering. That's probably the best way to describe it. We're going to talk about the media's coverage of trans issues, and we're going to talk about the raging debate about whether it's appropriate to criticize New York Times reporter Taylor Lorenz. So, Ben, let's start with the speech. Now, the speech here I have from Federalist senior editor Christopher Bedford. He wrote this piece here. If this week you learned Biden is hopeful and Tucker Carlson is evil, congratulations. You've been had by the corporate press. Now, Chris compiled these headlines. Biden tells nation there is hope after a devastating year. Hopeful Biden says, I need you. Biden sets vaccine goal that would allow Americans to gather by July 4. Those are headlines from The Times, the New York Times, the LA Times, the Boston Globe. Chris Cillizza had 7 takeaways from Biden's primetime address. And Playbook this morning literally was headlined, last night is why Joe Biden won the presidency. And that Playbook, by the way, focused in on the moment that Biden took out of his breast pocket a piece of paper that had coronavirus deaths on it. And they cast it, literally they compare it with George W. Bush in the rubble after 9/11. I'm not kidding. That's actually in Playbook this morning. So Ben, what is your take on this insanely friendly coverage?
Well, where to begin? And Susan Page at the Washington Post said this was a fireside chat without the fire. I mean, they just beclown themselves in so many ways. And I actually think what we ought to harken back to is American carnage. This was Joe Biden's American carnage speech. Now, he didn't provide the antidotes that the president provided in his address on Inauguration Day, but this was a dour, sad, demoralizing, and depressing affair where the high point was, guess what? Maybe I will allow you by decree, by royal decree, to get together with friends in the backyard and act like Americans on July 4th. Okay, you don't need any political official to tell you what you can and can't do like this. And the fact that the media then louds that as, oh, this is a great thing for the country. Like, don't you think maybe people in the media should ask the question, like, is there a problem of our betters that they're the ones that dictate to us whether or not we can act like normal human beings again and congregate and make our own assessments as to the risks? And we don't even need to go into the depths of their horrible coverage with respect to the coronavirus from start to finish. And oh, by the way, maybe they should have asked questions or pondered, isn't it interesting that President Biden didn't actually attribute any of the quick response and the benefits that we've seen in terms of the rapid deployment of the vaccine to his predecessor, which had he not executed those policies, we wouldn't have a vaccine to take to market within a year, which is unprecedented in the first place. And it's not like you expect him to give credit to his predecessor in a speech like this, but he didn't even acknowledge it, basically. Nor did he acknowledge in the speech how it was that we essentially imposed this economic suicide and carnage on the country. And of course, it was the blue states that imposed the most draconian measures of all of them. So like journalists should have a responsibility to ask the basic questions of, why do we have this carnage? Why was the president delivering such a dour and demoralizing speech? But instead, they take this depressing, somber affair and they turn it into, this was the most optimistic and hope springs eternal sort of speech. It just demonstrates perfectly, like, who are you going to trust? Your lying eyes or that? I mean, it's just, it boggles the mind that they expect to be taken seriously when you can look at the substance on the paper, read the transcript, and then juxtapose it with the headlines. And we're living in 2 completely different universes.
No, I like that point a lot because I think it's so essential to hammer home that the media loves to think of themselves as like policy heavy, like they're getting into the nitty gritty of all of this stuff. We saw that this week with their mockery of Republicans for even talking about cancel culture because Democrats were doing the hard work of COVID relief, even though Democrats also, by the way, were the ones out canceling Dr. Seuss for various reasons and defending the cancellation of Dr. Seuss for various reasons. So they like to cast themselves as the very like neutral arbiters of the nitty gritty policy facts. They're telling you what you need to know. And that's how they cast themselves. But actually, in reality, you take something that Biden's speech last night is a great example, has all of these serious implications. There are details they could be talking about, but instead, literally like Playbook did, they are comparing it to George Bush in the rubble of the World Trade Centers. Like, it's insane. They're all about aesthetics at the end of the day. It's what they talk about at like this. It's ultimately just sort of like how they feel about the news. And then sometimes they'll inject their factual analyses when they confirm the prior narrative. But this is what it's about. This is about confirming their narrative that Joe Biden is hopeful. He's the loving grandfather who is maturely taking the country into his hands. And that's their narrative. And when they see something that fits their narrative, they run with it. And I feel like that's exactly what happened last night. But what's sad is that, everything gets missed, right? Like the substance of it gets missed when it doesn't match their narrative. And it's one of the constant Rorschach tests that we have where half the country can watch one thing, half the country can watch something the other way. And the media only tells it, only speaks for that one half.
Look, the way that a straight media would have really reported this is the president had some remarks which were delivered in a very dour and somber fashion. And then he had what he would portray as some positive things, like we're going to try to mandate deployment of the vaccine so that everyone can get in line on May 1st. And then there would have been questioning of, okay, here's what was asserted. Why is it that these policies that we ended up with the kind of consequences that we ended up with? The president says, trust the science. If we trust the science, then what does the science say about school openings? What does the science say about people who are vaccinated being able to interact with other people across the country? There's none of that. It's all surface level, as you said, aesthetics. It's superficial. It's not about the substance, because the substance does not justify the narrative that this is some amazing White House that's leading us into a recovery. It just simply doesn't comport with the facts or even the messaging of the president, but they needed to whitewash the address.
Yeah, and the media just constantly reacts like partisans. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, they react to a Democratic president's speech the way that a Democratic staffer reacts to a Democratic president's speech. And then sometimes if something is sort of like glaringly off, and by the way, we're talking about the corporate media broadly. It's not that there aren't individual journalists who, by the way, I genuinely feel very bad for, who have like that, they still have the sort of like old ink-stained wretch impulse to do real fact checks and to be rigorous. There are a few of them that still exist, but broadly, the media's attitude is like the attitude of Democratic staffers. And that's why you see when somebody like Joe Biden gives a speech that sort of like superficially might be comforting and touch on the right notes, they will, for some people, for Democrats, they react as though, they're just regular Democratic staffers and they think that the speech was great. Don't you think it's like,
It's the Chris Matthews thrill up the leg all over again, brought into 2021. And then let's also not forget, because we always need to take the cynical view of this as well, because between cynicism and incompetence, it's usually one of the two. Of course, there were some in the media who acted tough in terms of challenging the administration on why isn't the president out there giving speeches and taking questions from us. Well, now they have to come out and be fawning to try to get back in the good graces of the administration for further access in the future. So don't forget the cynical points as well.
Yeah, that's unfortunately a good point. Let's move on to our second topic, which again, as happens every single week, there's a common thread through literally every conversation that we have, because it all comes back to media corruption, which is what this show, which is kindly sponsored by the National Journalism Center and a product of The Federalist, exists to do. So let's talk about this survey that came out this week. Really interesting. Here's a tweet from Federalist Politics editor John Daniel Davidson. Now look at those numbers. Playbook PM kicks off the results of a Politico Morning Consult poll showing broad support for the position to ban transgender athletes from competing in women's sports. So men, 59% support that ban, but let's keep going down the list here to where we get to millennials. Millennials, 56% support a ban. That's actually higher than baby boomers. And Gen Z is split pretty much evenly. Now, if you look at corporate media headlines about trans sports, and if you look at the way trans athletes competing in sports of biological segregation, when you look at the media's coverage of that, it's dramatically out of step with what we just saw in that poll. This is not a popular position, and this is not a mainstream position. And let me actually put John's tweet up one more time. He's saying, let's dispense with the notion that transgenderism, as pushed by the corporate media, big tech, Hollywood, and corporate America, is somehow mainstream. It's not even close to mainstream. It's a fringe view. And I think that is a really important point, because we do, we don't obviously, but people do refer to the corporate press, the legacy press, as the mainstream media. And it's true that they sort of play this role in curating what's mainstream because they're run by powerful corporations and powerful institutions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're mainstream with the public. Just because they try to represent the mainstream and they have a role in influencing what becomes mainstream, they are not mainstream. And I think this issue, as John points out, is exhibit A in fact, because the corporate media is populated by people from the radical cultural left who graduated from our colleges and now are in the workforce in boardrooms and in newsrooms and writers' rooms. This is what we're seeing, is that they're actually so out of touch with the mainstream of our culture and our country. They're not even close to it. They're actually radical. And what they're doing is using their power to enforce an radical elite worldview on the rest of the country.
Yeah, I suspect the media looks at a poll like that and says, we just haven't done a good enough job indoctrinating the millennials yet. Although there's a real question here that an investigative journalist would ask, which is, why do millennials diverge from even older age cohorts as well? How do you explain that? It's kind of interesting. And I think it would be a really fascinating study to see actually real gumshoe journalism, people going out and asking questions within these different demographic groups. To that broader point, and I think it's a really essential one, I've long held a theory, and I may have mentioned it on this program before, that the way to sort of understand the world in terms of the elite versus everyone else, or the ruling class versus those unfortunate enough to labor under their rule, is that what those on the coasts think is mainstream is actually radical. And what the rest of the country thinks is mainstream, those on the coast think is radical. And it's a really small percentage of people on the coast who actually hold these positions of power in the commanding heights, but they obviously have disproportionate influence on society. And you see it when they assume that these issues, like should your daughter in high school have to be competing against a biological male in XYZ sport, they think that's a rational outcome, or maybe they think that's the outcome that social justice demands, and everyone else looks at that and is horrified and thinks it's abhorrent. I think one of the questions that I would ask about this, and I'm curious if you have a sense of it, is why do you believe that those in the media feel they have to ram a position like this down the throats of Americans? And I mean, obviously this extends to the corporate world as well. Is it purely a virtue signaling thing? Do they actually believe it to their core? Why would they keep pushing on an issue like this? What's the point of it?
There's definitely incentives for performative social justice wokeism in the corporate press, and also in the corridors of power in general. And that's because they're now, again, populated by people who come from those places where it's rewarded, like our system of higher education in this country. But I'll also add, and this is one of the common threads we come back to every week, the progressive or bigot binary. So you have to, when you believe that any dissent from full-throated progressive dogma is necessarily bigotry, as they do, if you read Ibram X. Kendi, if you read Robin DiAngelo, if you go back and you read some of the foundational texts for critical race theory and the current social justice movement, you can see why a media populated by people who have gone through our system of higher education, which has steadily radicalized, would believe that anybody who does not accept every single tenet of progressivism. So J.K. Rowling, a firm progressive who has been hashtag canceled because she dissents a little bit on hormone treatment for children, she's totally out, and she's called the transphobe, she's called the bigot. And so that's why they treat this as though it's something that needs to be rammed down everybody's throats, because they believe that anybody who disagrees is a bigot. And it's really, 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 really dangerous, and also just it's impossible to argue against, because when you have the people in positions of power saying that your argument is tantamount to bigotry, it is bigotry, and in some cases it's physical violence. That's how the New York Times newsroom literally reacted to Tom Cotton's op-ed that was retracted. They all tweeted in concert that it put Black staffers in danger, quote, in danger. So when you believe dissent is bigotry, and when you believe dissent from progressivism can be violence and be dangerous, we're in a really bad position. And actually here at the National Journalism Center, we have Friday classes. And one thing that keeps coming up over the course of this semester, one of my assigned texts for the interns, people wouldn't expect it, but it's actually coming apart. And that's to the point you just made about how people on the coasts have totally different values. And that is in a lot of ways because we sort based on socioeconomic status, which is heavily influenced by your education. And so for me, Coming Apart was a really formative book because growing up in Wisconsin, I don't mean to just like ramble here, but growing up in Wisconsin, it sort of explained the disconnect I saw between how I grew up and the values that I was encountering in the corporate media from Hollywood and the news media. So that text, I think, is such a good way that everything just sort of starts to line up when you understand how we're sorting. And, that's why I assign it. But what do you think about, how do you think that plays into all of this?
Yeah, look, so much of this is cultural. And, it's funny because those on the left, and particularly, of course, those in the corporate media, sometimes act as if there are no difference between cultures, even though they say, like, let's embrace diversity, but for them, that really means, like, let's try to wield diversity as a cudgel to attack our political adversaries. And they don't actually care, of course, about diversity of thought, which is the important thing that's actually under our control. But I do think this does go back to your point to the cultural issue. And it's worth noting in Coming Apart, which really everyone should read, that in the book, Murray talks about the fact that those elites who live in these bubbles, in these sort of cul-de-sacs of now elite wokeism, themselves live very normal, traditional lives. They don't espouse the traditional lives that they live, which ultimately help produce flourishing, at least to a degree, among their children. They say sort of anything goes and they're non-judgmental and the like. But then in their own personal lives, they act sort of like what the kind of WASP archetype was 50 or 100 years ago in this country. So it's worth noting also the hypocrisy of it. For all the wokeism and the virtue signaling and the like, these people live very traditional lives. And they would actually do a service to the country if they did say, like, there are certain cultural traits that actually are superior to other ones. They won't. I mean, of course, you get attacked for that. Bourgeois values has come under attack from our crusaders in the corporate media. But the reality is they could actually serve a positive role to the extent they did sort of highlight the values that they live in their own lives, but they'll never do that.
Yeah, it's a great point. And it's one that Tim Carney makes in Alienated America as well. He calls it the Lena Dunham thesis, something like that. And it's true. And if you watched Girls all the way through, you would know that it's true. But it's a really valid point. And I look at something like OnlyFans. I've written about this a couple of times. OnlyFans, which is basically DIY porn website. This is something that the elites totally promote. ABC News just had a special on it that was really disgustingly an endorsement with little criticism. And you know who that really ends up hurting? Normalizing DIY pornography doesn't hurt people in coastal newsrooms because they're not doing it, because they aren't desperate for money. It hurts people who are. It hurts people in situations who say, listen, I just read a BuzzFeed article. I don't think it's that bad. I think it's empowering. I'm a woman. I just think that this is something I should do to pay the bills this month. So it doesn't hurt elites. And that's a really good point, Ben. I think that's a huge, huge, huge part of all of this is that they normalize things for the rest of the country that they don't want, to hit their own, it's like NIMBY, right? Like it's a total NIMBY situation. And with that, this is such a perfect segue, just as the last one was a perfect segue into our third topic, which is Taylor Lorenz of the New York Times. Now, Taylor Lorenz of the New York Times is a reporter She's a reporter on technology issues. So she covers things like TikTok, and she covers things like Instagram, like influencer culture, basically. And she's gotten a lot of plaudits from the corporate press for this. She's a very popular and I would say influential and powerful reporter. She is considered a reporter by the New York Times, although she's come out in favor of abortion and other issues. She's clearly a leftist, and that's not really even up for debate. But that's sort of like one of those things that has been normalized to the point where we don't even question it anymore that the New York Times has her as a reporter. But Taylor Lorenz tweeted something hilarious for International Women's Day about how people need to think about the harassment that she's endured online. Now, Tucker criticized her for this. It became a firestorm after Tucker Carlson's criticism because people said he was putting Taylor Lorenz in danger, literally because he kept repeating her full name. That's the argument. Let's play the clip. We were not going to be able to watch the whole thing because it's like 5.5 minutes long and it's great and everyone should look it up. But here you go.
In April, a Fox Nation exclusive.
Newspapers generally try to keep themselves out of the news. They don't weigh in to defend their own reporters, for example, unless something very serious has happened. You see when a correspondent is being detained by soldiers at the Tibetan border, for instance, or when someone's been kidnapped by ISIS in Syria. But you generally don't see it in response to criticism from a cable news show. But today, the New York Times made an exception to that rule and jumped ferociously to the defense of its social media reporter, Taylor Lorenz. Now, we told you about Taylor Lorenz last night in a segment about how the most privileged in our society now consider themselves oppressed. And Taylor Lorenz is certainly a shining example of that principle. A New York Times reporter from Greenwich telling you what a victim she is. Earlier this week, Lorenz sent a tweet asking America to celebrate International Women's Day by supporting her specifically, as she faces what she describes as a year-long campaign of harassment. That harassment, Lorenz wrote, has, quote, destroyed my life. Now, normally we'd be deeply sympathetic to this.
I'm cutting it off there because that quote is so funny, that the harassment has destroyed her life. She is a New York Times reporter. Like, granted, I'm sure the harassment sucks. I'm sure it's bad. I don't doubt that for a second. But it's sort of like Meghan Markle and Prince Harry going on Oprah and talking about how their glass is half empty when their glass is clearly half full, if not completely full. It's just a matter of perspective. And that's somebody from Greenwich, educated in a Swiss boarding school, who now makes a great salary at the New York Times and has the support of the entire corporate press, with the exception of Tucker Carlson, says that her life has been destroyed. It's unbelievable that somebody could see that as the wreckage of a life, as the total destruction of a life. As Tucker says later in that segment, the New York Times has sent reporters to his house to report on him. He didn't take to the airwaves and cast himself as a victim. It's not because he wasn't in some technical sense perhaps a victim of the New York Times' weirdness and creepiness, in the same way that Lorenz is technically a victim of harassment. Absolutely. It's a matter of perspective, and that her perspective tells her she is a victim is the entire point. And the fact that the entire corporate press jumped to her defense breathlessly and said it was dangerous for Tucker to say her name, to say the name Taylor Lorenz, because he's purposefully trying to sick social media trolls on her, is outrageous and disgusting. And Glenn Greenwald had a great point about how the elites exploit identity politics to protect the neoliberal order. This is about class. That's what it is at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's so well said. And it also bears noting, just stepping back, Taylor Lorenz is the ultimate aggressor. And this is someone who lurks in Clubhouse to try to find areas, first of all, people that she can attack. Like she accused Mark Andreessen, of Andreessen Horowitz, a massive tech-focused venture capital firm. So, maybe not on his face going to be the most sympathetic figure to a mass audience. However, she accused him of using the R slur, so-called, which is saying that something was retarded, in a Clubhouse room, ascribed it to him. He did not say it. She attacked him again separately for saying something that he did not say in a room. And she essentially has called for people to report on their fellow interlocutors in these Clubhouse chats of abusive rhetoric, harassment, essentially PC policing. So, and beyond that, she also, it seems, sort of like grooms as sources 15-year-olds to try to talk about, the different areas within tech that she purportedly reports on. So this is someone who in some ways is engaged in like really deeply creepy sort of behavior under the guise of journalism. And then beyond that, she attacks people all the time, and she tries to go after people and essentially knows she's going to sick a huge Twitter mob on them, or worse, potentially. So my friend Roger Kimball, I believe, coined the term cry bully. That is exactly who Taylor Lorenz is. But it's even bigger than her, because it does implicate these points about, okay, speech that you don't like is harassment and effectively violence, but then you can act with impunity and attack anyone you want because you are the good and the just and the virtuous. So there's that level of it. But then there is this element of like she's abusing her role, and then whenever anyone dares to criticize her, which a journalist should be open to that criticism and respond to it, she then goes out and attacks people. It's using sort of identity as a shield to protect yourself, and then also using identity politics to attack other people with impunity. And so what is the proper response to this is it should be called out, and we should call things by their name and not be cowed into not criticizing on the merits. It's a teachable moment of the fact that the media can give it, but they can never take it. And they ought to receive criticism on the merits, which we try to do here. We try not to engage in ad hominem, even though we have our deeply held beliefs. We try to engage on the substance. Those like Taylor Lorenz cannot engage on the substance.
Yeah, absolutely. That is really well said. And she, again, you mentioned that she basically has these sources that are like 15-year-olds. She's talked before about how difficult it is to like get a camera crew into a kid's house without their parents knowing, because often they don't want their parents to know. Like it's not unfair to criticize her methodology. Like it's actually well within the boundaries of reasonable criticism to say like, how are you getting all of these 14-year-olds to talk to you? Are you doing it ethically? Is it ethical to sort of circumvent their parents and to, by the way, she's also like she's also sort of enforced the progressive or bigot binary to get people canceled, like to get social media users canceled who are popular because, for instance, their mom is like a really big Trump supporter and a critic of radical Islam. Like she's been behind those efforts. So to say that like a really powerful New York Times reporter is in fact a victim who cannot be criticized harshly by other members of the press, it speaks to what the press expects from the press, right? Like they don't want Tucker Carlson to criticize them. They don't want anybody to criticize them. And if you do criticize them, you're not just mean and annoying and somebody who disagrees that could be fun and, engaging with whom to debate. That's not what you are. You are a bad person. You are sicking harassment and trolls on Taylor Lorenz. It's like, it's not as though it's another great example of how we don't just disagree anymore. And it's not the right's fault that we don't just disagree anymore. It's the left's fault because they cast all disagreement as either bigotry or literal harassment. And that's insane. And again, it's not conservatives who are enforcing those standards. That's not to say that conservatives don't sometimes act like snowflakes, so to speak. It happens sometimes because partisans sort of get in that way and get defensive, whatever. But in these cases, 8 out of 10 times, it's the left that is normalizing and creating these standards and enforcing them. And it's a huge source of division.
I just think you shouldn't call yourself a journalist if you're in reality a culture warrior and you're engaging in activism. And also, you always have to point out, like, if the Republicans did this, what would the response be? Like, her entire beat is essentially, imagine if you or I were the ones trying to get into the homes of the teens to interview them and get them and create wedges within families. Your exploiting minors would be like the least of what they would refer to you every time you were described as a purported journalist. So once again, of course, there's the hypocrisy of this as well. And that's just like a little footnote in the awfulness of this entire story.
It's true. That is a footnote. No, and it is, as Greenwald wrote, just a great example of how elites exploit identity politics to protect the neoliberal order. And, it's Glenn Greenwald. We've bring him up all the time on this program. Not somebody that we probably would have agreed with a lot, a few years ago, but now that he's sort of shifted his focus and is focused in on criticizing the corporate press, it's really sharp criticism. And it does go to show that everybody who sort of criticizes the classism of the corporate press, it's on the left and it's on the right, and you are ostracized to Substack, where Greenwald now publishes his work, because if you are somebody who says, what the heck is the media doing rushing to Taylor Lorenz's defense and acting as though she is literally beyond criticism? She should be immune to harsh criticism. It's outrageous. And that's how, you have the left and the right increasingly aligned, between Greenwald and Molly Hemingway and what we're doing here and Barry Weiss. And that's why you have this Joe Rogan. That's why all of these people are sort of outside of corporate institutions and are building bigger audiences that way, honestly.
Yeah, and it shows the chasm between sort of where the public is and where, again, our ruling class is. I think it's a sad thing that you can name on a couple hands the only people who we might be at total cross purposes with and violently disagree on any number of issues. But we do agree on the core issue of speech, intellectual honesty, exploring issues, debating them to the death, but doing so in a civil fashion is critical. So if there's anything that should be unifying, it's that we have to agree that there ought to be an open marketplace of ideas and let the best ones win. And so we will on this show promote people, even with whom we disagree on almost everything else, to the extent they stand for that principle of let's have free and open inquiry and open and honest debate and actual real curiosity about the world around us, and not just be partisan activists at all times, and expose those partisan activists when they are out there doing what they do.
Yeah. And I do think it is ultimately classist, because it's, going back to coming apart, it's how our educated elites sort into coastal bubbles that are also cultural bubbles. And that's just, I think, an extremely important element of all of this, because you have the socioeconomic elites enforcing now their cultural worldview on the entire country in a way that does really disempower everyday Americans, and particularly working class people who lack the resources to go start a Patreon or a Substack successfully when they're canceled. So with that, we always try to end on a happy note here, bud.
I'm not sure what the happy message there is, except that there are still some people out there with their heads on straight, and we will continue to highlight those positive voices that exist, because it takes a few people standing up, speaking boldly and courageously to inspire millions of people at the end of the day. So it's important that we always look to the good stories as well as all the bad news. There's a silver lining in the bad news, and it's Friday, so how bad can it be?
So that's good news, at least. But yeah, the name of the show is Bad News, because I think you and I are both in agreement that the bulk of news is bad. And we're not going to pretend otherwise, because the bulk of what's coming out of the corporate press is bad news. It's bad news in that it's destroying the country, and it's bad news just in a literal sense. It is not good news. They're not doing a good job at conveying the news. So with that, we'll sign off for today, but we would encourage you certainly to subscribe. We do this on Wednesdays and Fridays, where we break down some of the worst news of the week in terms of the coverage, the media's worst coverage of the week. We break it down. Bad news, we see it as the media criticism show that the right deserves. We are a project of the Federalist. We're sponsored by the National Journalism Center, from where we're broadcasting today, and we will be back soon with more. So until then, please stay tuned.